Good afternoon, and welcome to part two of Below and Above, Storing Carbon in the Pennsylvania Landscape. My name is Matt Gobler, and I am a member of the Conservation and Natural Resources Advisory Council, known as CNRAC. CNRAC is a bipartisan advisory council that was created in 1995 by the same legislation that created the state agency known as the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, or DCNR. CNRAC members include the Secretary of DCNR, Cindy Dunn, and 18 citizen members who are appointed by the governor and both houses of the General Assembly. One of our goals as an advisory council is to create conversations between the department and members of the public around topics of particular interest. This is why we call this kind of program a CNRAC conversation. Last month, in part one of this series, panelists shared information about how carbon can be stored beneath the surface of the earth, with a special focus on how underground carbon storage can occur in Pennsylvania, and how the Pennsylvania Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, especially the Bureau of Geological Survey, plays a critical role in enabling these efforts. Today, in part two, we will discuss how our forests contribute to above-ground carbon sequestration and storage. With over 2 million acres of forest lands, the DCNR Bureau of Forestry is Pennsylvania's largest forest landowner, underscoring the important role the department has in impacting forest management and carbon sequestration and storage across the landscape. I have a few housekeeping notes before we begin our presentations. First, please note that this session is being recorded for training and record-keeping purposes. By participating in this session, you are consenting to the recording, retention, and use of this session. While audience members are in listen-only mode, we do encourage you to ask questions. We will offer a brief question and answer session after each panelist. Please use the Teams chat feature to type your questions for the speaker. We will also invite you to ask questions of the entire panel at the end of the program, if time permits. Finally, on behalf of CNRAC, we thank you for joining us today, and we hope you enjoy the program. It is my pleasure to introduce our panel of speakers. Seth Castle was recently appointed by the Pennsylvania Department of Conservation and Natural Resources to serve as Pennsylvania's 18th state forester and director of the Bureau of Forestry. Seth has worked for the Bureau of Forestry for 23 years in various positions. DCNR Secretary Cindy Dunn describes Seth's new role as critical in DCNR's operations and leadership, as well as on the national level related to forest management issues. In addition to his position with DCNR, Seth serves as a lieutenant colonel in the Pennsylvania Air National Guard. Second, we'll hear from Sean Lehman. Sean is the program manager for Resource Inventory and Monitoring Section within DCNR's Bureau of Forestry. He started his career with the Bureau of Forestry in 1997 and has held positions as a timber management forester, forest planner, and biometrician. Sean currently works from the Bureau's Spring Mills, Pennsylvania location and focuses on implementing DCNR's continuous forest inventory and Marcellus shale gas monitoring on state forest land. Sean's professional experience also includes working for the National Park Service and the Pennsylvania Game Commission. Third, we will hear from Sarah Hall. Sarah resides in the Pocono Mountains of Pennsylvania, and she is the Director of Forestry for the Family Forest Carbon Program at the American Forest Foundation. She leads a team of senior foresters and staff foresters to unlock the power of Pennsylvania's family forests to combat climate change. Sarah has over 10 years of experience in sustainable forestry, forest products, and natural climate solutions, such as forest carbon. Before handing off to our first panelist, I would like to share some brief background information on Pennsylvania's forest resources and how they sequester and store carbon. Pennsylvania contains 16.6 million acres of forests. That's approximately 58% of the state's land area. Over 90% of our forests are hardwood trees, that is, trees with leaves rather than needles. Pennsylvania has the largest hardwood forest volume of any state in the U.S. and has continuously ranked as the nation's leading producer and exporter of hardwood lumber and logs for many years. Wood truly is a renewable resource. Despite being the nation's leading hardwood producer, Pennsylvania has consistently increased its forest wood volume over time. Pennsylvania's forests today contain over 5 times more board feet of wood than they did in the 1950s. 1 board foot is the volume of wood contained in a piece that is 12 inches square by 1 inch thick. While our forests continue to grow at a rate of about 3 to 4 billion board feet a year, only about 1 billion is harvested. Trees accounting for another half to 1 billion board feet will die on their own each year, leaving over 2 billion board feet of net growth each year. Let's briefly look at Pennsylvania's forest age. While Pennsylvania's forests were heavily harvested and in many cases clear-cut during the Industrial Revolution, they have regrown into mature forests over the past 100 years. Eastern hardwood trees have a typical maximum lifespan of 120 to 140 years. Over 2/3 of Pennsylvania's forests are over 60 years old, and nearly half are over 80. Meanwhile, only 1/8 are under 40. The next graph will show why this matters as it relates to carbon. This graph shows the relationship among several factors: the volume of carbon a forest stores, the rate of carbon a forest sequesters, and the forest's age. But first, let's go over a few definitions. For those of you who participated in the Part 1 webinar, the terms sequestration and storage were used interchangeably, which is correct when speaking of placing captured carbon below the ground. However, in forests, we tend to use the words sequestration and storage to describe different concepts. Carbon storage means holding carbon in a manner that ensures it is not in the atmosphere. In forests, this typically refers to carbon that is stored in the mass of a tree, where it makes up approximately half of the mass of a wood log. We measure carbon storage in units of volume, or volume per acre. Carbon sequestration refers to the process of removing carbon from the air and converting it to a stored form. In a forest, this is the process of photosynthesis, by which carbon dioxide is removed from the air and the carbon is split off from the oxygen and becomes part of the tree. We measure sequestration as a rate, or units of volume, or volume per acre over some period of time. This graph shows how forest age impacts carbon storage and sequestration. The green curve on this graph shows how carbon storage builds up in a forest stand over time. As trees grow, they store more carbon. But as trees reach maturity, the volume levels off as the trees stop growing larger. The brown curve shows the rate that forests sequester carbon based on forest age. As you can see, younger forest stands sequester carbon more rapidly than older trees. Putting these two pieces of data together enables us to work to optimize the carbon equation in our forests. Older forests store more carbon, like a warehouse. Younger forests remove carbon from the atmosphere more rapidly. That is why sustainable forestry can help. Older trees can be harvested and continue to store carbon in the form of flooring or furniture or some other form, while making room on the landscape for young trees that will regrow and sequester carbon more quickly. Here is a look at how wood stores carbon when trees are harvested. The graph on the left shows the results of a study that was done on a red oak tree in Pennsylvania. The red bottom portion of the graph shows the amount of carbon stored in the tree when the tree was harvested. The multicolored bands at the top of the graph show the amount of carbon emitted in the process of harvesting, processing, and transporting the tree and delivering its lumber to the end user. In this intentionally extreme example, the tree was harvested in Pennsylvania, sawmilled and kiln-dried in the state of Indiana, transported to a seaport, and then shipped to a customer in Japan. Despite all of this processing and transportation, that oak tree still stored more carbon than the process of producing it emitted, and we refer to this as being carbon negative. Wood is the only common building material that can credibly make that claim. The chart on the right provides a comparison with other common building materials. With this baseline of information, it is now my pleasure to introduce our first panelist, Pennsylvania's State Forester, Seth Castle.
Thanks, Matt, for that introduction, and both the introduction of the panelists, but also for that very good introduction of the topic. I'm going to share my screen here. Give me a moment. All right, so I'm going to open up our panelists today to talk about a little bit about the Bureau of Forestry and our thoughts and approach to looking at the carbon issue as it relates to forest management. I do thank CNRAC for putting this together, and I really like the name of the title, CNRAC Conversation, because this is an emerging topic, and we're very it's another example how forests are being relied upon in society and looked at for solutions. But it's also a topic that we need to learn a lot more about, and the more that we work together as partners and organizations and have these kinds of conversations about what we're learning and our thoughts, the better we're going to be able to advance our understanding of carbon and forest management. So the Bureau of Forestry, we have responsibilities, statewide responsibilities to conserve, enhance, and steward the Commonwealth's forest resources. A lot of people know the Bureau of Forestry by the 2.2 million acres of state forest land that we have, but we have leadership roles, partnership roles, technical assistance roles, and ensuring that all forests in the Commonwealth are sustainable and help provide all the values that people expect from our forests. And we have a lot of different roles, whether or not you're talking about conserving native wild plants. We have roles in forest health. We have roles with fire management and fire suppression and fire management. And of course, working with private forest landowners, there's a lot of different roles that we have in forest conservation. And so a lot of what we're going to talk about today is a little bit more geared toward the state forest side of things. But we also think that, the work that we do on the 2.2 million acres of state forest land is really important to model management and as a tool to help us communicate to all landowners across the Commonwealth. Some of the things that we tried, some of the best management practices, some of the learnings that we have, and sort of model that sustainable management. And we are certified by both the Sustainable Forestry Initiative and the Forest Stewardship Council. So when we talk about those, we have some principles that we have developed to communicate how we think about carbon management across, especially our state forest system. I want to point out that our state forest system has always been a place where we've managed for multiple uses and values. We think a balanced approach is important when looking at our management, and accommodating forest carbon values is no different. It's one of the many values that we try to manage for society and for Pennsylvania. When we approach our state forest management, we do take an ecosystem approach. So we look at all the ways that resources and different values are interconnected across the landscape. So we could be talking about native wild plants and wildlife habitat, soils, other impacts or other things that drive the ecosystem. We try to think about how those things are interconnected. And we reflect that in our management by trying to zone and account for those different values across the landscape. So we do have areas that are maybe heavy for recreational use. We have areas that are heavy for forest management, active forest management, and silviculture. And we also have areas that are where our goals are associated with water quality and stream buffers. And then we also have areas that we have set aside as wild and natural areas that are quasi-wilderness type areas that protect special communities and special experiences. And a lot of these areas, the forest is allowed to grow, in perpetuity, or what we call proposed old growth, where in a couple hundred years these areas will be old growth. So there's a lot of different things going on across the landscape in how we manage the state forest system. And so these carbon principles reflect a lot of those different approaches to our management. We do practice sustainable forestry and scientific silviculture on our state forest system. And when we grow forests, it takes work. They just don't, the work that we do with harvesting and ensuring regeneration just doesn't happen on its own. It takes a lot of science-based research, developing science-based practices on the ground to make sure that we are growing the forest in the best way. And perhaps most importantly, when we do harvest trees, that we're ensuring that there's a healthy, vibrant, young forest there to regenerate and be the future forest of Pennsylvania. As we think about these forest carbon principles that we have, and these are going to get into those topics right now, there's a series of principles that help frame how we look at storing carbon. One of the most important things that we can do is to ensure that we keep forest as forest. If you look at that graph on the right-hand side, it shows how, in the the early days, of the 1600s and beyond, we almost were, 95% forested, and you see that dip down in that era of exploitation that Matt was talking about. And then we started to gain forest, and we've been leveled off for many decades, and we are seeing some indicators that we might be starting to lose forest again. We've been around that 60% rate. And we're trying to figure out what's the margin of error and what's maybe some change in data collection, but there are some concerns that we might be beginning to lose forest. And so we want to definitely stop that. In fact, we want to increase forest land in Pennsylvania, through a variety of practices. But some of the research that we've done and some of the modeling we've seen, one of the best things that we can do is make sure we keep forests as forests, and even better yet, create more forests in the Commonwealth. To help store and sequester carbon across the landscape to mitigate for climate change. One of the things that we've definitely found as we think about the carbon value is to really take a big picture landscape approach when looking at our forests. And what I mean by this is healthy forests are really important for carbon management. So if your forest isn't healthy and resilient, it's not going to reach its potential when it comes to storing carbon, storing and sequestering carbon. So we believe one of the most important things is to make sure that those forests are healthy and resilient. So trying to protect as best as we can from insect and destructive insects, in a lot of cases invasive insects and diseases, encouraging sustainable harvesting practices, controlling invasive species, reducing deer browse that prevents new forests from becoming established, and in some cases controlling wildfires. And so making sure that our forests are healthy across the landscape is really important. And so if you have an older forest that is growing and storing carbon, that's really important. But if that forest becomes unhealthy and those trees start to die, then we're in a situation where we're not having the carbon benefit that we might want. And so keeping those forests growing and healthy is really critical to our work. Along those same lines, planting trees is one of the simplest things that someone can do, not only in your backyard, but if you own forest land, and of course us as the Bureau of Forestry, planting trees and making sure where we don't have natural regeneration, that we're supplementing that with planting trees. There's also a lot of opportunities in urban areas, riparian zones, abandoned mine lands, to take areas that don't have trees or aren't fully stocked with trees and plant trees to pull up and really sequester and store as much carbon as that landscape, as that land can sequester or store. So the more trees that we plant, the more areas we restore. That gets back into trying to create more areas of forest land in the Commonwealth. So doing those things, it's something that we all can participate in, and it's a really important carbon benefit. Conserving and enhance wetlands. A lot of people might not realize that our efforts to conserve wetlands and enhance wetlands and create wetlands in some areas, so that also is an important carbon benefit. The soil, the underlying areas of the wetlands hold a lot of carbon, and so making sure that the wetlands that we have, that we're protecting them, we're protecting those functions. But if there are opportunities to create enhanced wetlands, that also has a carbon benefit. So making sure that we're tending our wetland resources as best we can is one area of forest management that people don't think about sometimes when they're thinking about carbon management. We talked a little bit about regenerating forests, and that is one of the primary responsibilities as a forester and a forestry organization. When you're doing that harvesting and you're contributing to that wood products economy, that you're using it as an opportunity to regenerate the forest. And the more diverse, the more rigorous that regeneration is, the better carbon benefit we have, but also the more healthy and healthy that forest is in the long run. We know that having a variety of age classes across the landscape contributes to forest health overall. There are a lot of discussions about the role of old growth and later successional forests. Matt, I'm glad Matt brought that graph into play because it does show older forests do store a lot of carbon. And so we think it's an important part of a balanced forest management approach to consider some of those healthy, older, late successional forests that are doing a good job of storing carbon just by growing and maintaining that older, later successional condition. And as I mentioned earlier, in the Bureau of Forestry, our state forest system, we have some existing old growth areas that are remnants from the logging areas that weren't logged in the 1900s, that we've been gifted those resources and we're protecting them. But there's also opportunities to create more later successional forests in old growth areas. And roughly, somewhere about a half of our forests, there might be opportunities to advance later successional forests that have a carbon benefit. I do want to emphasize with this, though, it gets back with the making sure our forests are healthy too, because along with ensuring these later successional forests, we want to make sure they stay healthy. If there are mortality events or health issues with some of these older forests, we have to go in and try to protect those forests or manage them in a way to keep them healthy. And if they're not, maybe look for opportunities if it's in the right area, to harvest some of those trees and make them durable wood products to keep storing carbon. And that relates to the use of, like I just mentioned, durable wood products. I think it is a great story, and Matt brought it up a little bit, that we have to tell more often, that you can sustainably manage the forest, that you can do all these things across the landscape, and you can have a sustainable timber harvest and get a young, vigorous forest that is really good at sequestering carbon, pulling that carbon in from the atmosphere. But the larger trees that we harvested, that we turned into durable wood products, the floors that you might be standing on, or the chair that you might be sitting on right now, or the desk you might have in your office, or the kitchen cabinetry, all those things continue to store carbon for a very long time. And that is a great story to tell of sustainable forestry and our wood products economy, how it contributes to carbon storage and helps mitigate for climate change. And then above all, practice that sustainable forest management. Beyond thinking about all these different carbon management, ways to enhance carbon management, practicing sustainable forest management is one of the important things that we can do, or any forest landowner can do. Protecting soil health. There are a lot of carbon storage that happens in our soils, and so we want to do our best when we're doing activities like road building or harvesting, that we're following best management practices to protect our forest health or our soil health. And then lastly, as far as our principles, before we get into talking about some of the efforts that we have ongoing, but to learn, plan, monitor, and adapt. And that gets in, I think, to the role of this CNRAC conversation here, is that we're all learning in this space. We don't have everything figured out. And what I just presented are some principles, but they need fine-tuned. We need more research. We need more monitoring to have a better understanding of how we enhance carbon storage and sequestration across the landscape. So learning from academic institutions, learning from different organizations is really important as we go forward with this topic. Okay, I'm going to spend just a couple of minutes here, the last few minutes of my presentation, just talking about some of the different research and collaborations we have going on to help with that understanding, so we can be adaptive and learn and do a better job with carbon management in our state forests. So we do have a Climate Alliance grant that we're working with. And this is an effort that it's really interesting. It's helping us understand different management practices and how these different practices contribute to carbon management. So it's basically putting out different scenarios to help us understand some of the things that we might do. And we put this graph in here, just not that for you to really look at it and comprehend it, but just to understand all the different scenarios that we ran with our partners with American Forest and Michigan State University, just trying to figure out, what are some of the different pathways we have. And some of the key takeaways, really came down to what we've been saying a little bit earlier, is that good forest management definitely is good carbon management. We can really increase the amount of carbon that's sequestered and stored in our forests by doing several different practices. As we said before, increasing our current forests, increasing current forest cover, but also reducing the amount of deforestation that's taking place. And also doing things like tree planting, afforestation, and things like silvopasture. Combining tree planting with agricultural activities, but also things like limiting deer browsing, restocking understocked stands, in some cases extending rotations when it's appropriate, and encouraging sustainable practices, sustainable harvesting practices. All these things that we a lot of times think of when we think about sustainable forestry all have a big impact on the ability of the Commonwealth's forests to sequester and store carbon. We also have some economic trade-off analyses going on that is partnering with the U.S. Forest Service and Michigan State University, looking at some of the economic trade-offs under various carbon management strategies. And that work is ongoing, and we're looking forward to reporting more about that in the future. We're working with the Northeast Climate Hub and partnering with Penn State Department of Ecosystem Science and Management and the Center for Private Forests, Penn State Center for Private Forests, to look at some different ways to encourage carbon carbon credits across different ownerships in Pennsylvania. So there's a lot of discussion about carbon markets and doing some research in this project to think about forest carbon cooperatives and what that could potentially look at to encourage and incentivize carbon sequestration and storage in Pennsylvania. And that work is also very interesting. Work is also ongoing. And then we're looking at different ways to better understand the carbon dynamics across the landscape. How can we model and understand the carbon across the landscape, some of the variability across the landscape, so we can not only better understand that, but also better manage for it and adjust our practices based on some of those differences that we see in carbon storage and sequestration across the landscape. So that kind of predictive modeling that will help us inform management decisions. And then lastly, we also have our strategic planning process. And so we are in the final phases of developing our strategic plan. And we talk a lot about carbon on the landscape, the resiliency of our forests, not only in weathering the impacts of climate change, but also mitigating the impacts of climate change. And we also think that connecting our forests with people is also important, because all these values, they're all things that people can contribute to. You can plant a tree. If you own forest land, you can encourage sustainable harvesting on your property. And all these things kind of come together. So it's very important for us to think about people as we think about these management practices. So we are looking at developing the strategic plan and finishing it here in coming months. And all these things come together to really set the stage for us to advance our work in the coming years with our partners to do a better job storing carbon and educating others about it, and doing our best to make sure the forests of the Commonwealth are conserved, but also doing the work that they need to do to mitigate for the impacts of climate change. So with that, I think I will go ahead and stop there and hand it off to the moderator for the next part of the call.
Thank you very much, Seth. We do have time. We have one question that I wanted to present to you, and that puts us right on time for the next presenter. We have a question from a participant who's asking, can you discuss the benefits related to oxygen in addition to the benefits related to carbon from forest management?
benefits of oxygen. I mean, um, so I guess if I think I'm understanding the question, and thank you for the question. I mean, so I think, there are so many values that our forests provide, and we can list them off. And often when we list those off, clean air and clean water are some of the first things that we say, because they're probably the most important. I know a district forester who often says, "Boy, you can't live very long without clean air and clean water," and that's our forest providing those values. And so our forests play a very important role in not only and our native plants, not only providing oxygen for us to live, but also for cleaning air, for cleaning and mitigating from the impacts of different types of pollution. So yes, I would say that's up there in our rank of importance, is making sure that we providing oxygen, but providing clean oxygen for all of us.
Seth, I would agree, and I think it's really fascinating where we are in this conversation with carbon, in that for years many folks have thought of photosynthesis as the primary benefit being oxygen returned to those of us who need to breathe it.
Yeah.
And it really is fascinating. We're spending a lot of time now in these conversations looking at the other side of that equation, as it relates to the carbon that is removed in addition to the oxygen that is returned. So a really great way to tie the whole discussion together. Right. With that, Seth, thank you very much, and we'll come back to you at the end of the webinar for hopefully for a question and answer period with the whole panel. But now I have the pleasure of introducing Sean Lehman from DCNR, who will take on the second portion of today's presentation. Sean, go ahead.
All right, thank you very much. Again, I'm Sean Lehman. I'm the program manager for the Resource Inventory and Monitoring section of the Bureau of Forestry. And I'm going to give you a brief primer on forest carbon and carbon markets. But before we get into that, I do believe it's important that we talk just a little bit about the carbon cycle and some of the terms that we use when we're talking about carbon. So carbon is all around us, okay? So carbon moves among different carbon stores, or what we refer to as carbon pools. So these pools include our geologic formations of the planet, which those are the ones that store the most carbon. And then that's followed by the oceans, then the terrestrial land masses. And keep in mind, this includes all the plants, the trees, the soil, the animals, and people. And then we have that smallest pool, which is the atmosphere. And even though the atmospheric carbon pool is the smallest of the carbon pools in terms of the quantity of carbon it stores, it's this atmospheric carbon pool that gets the most attention. And that's because the carbon in the atmosphere is the carbon that can most affect global temperatures and climate change. So now when we talk about carbon on the planet, it's important to note that there's a finite amount of carbon that we have in our system. There's really only so much of it, and that quantity doesn't change. And that's because carbon is governed by the law of conservation of mass, which really just means that carbon is neither created nor destroyed. It's just moving around among the different carbon pools as part of the carbon cycle. And this moving around of carbon among the different carbon pools is what we refer to as flux. And the quantity of carbon we have is important because remember, most life on Earth is carbon-based, so we really don't want to lose carbon. So when it comes to carbon, the concern we have is really about where it's being stored among the major carbon pools. And this is a zero-sum game, which means if carbon is released from one pool, it's got to go to another pool. It just doesn't disappear. It goes to another pool, and that pool is typically the atmospheric carbon pool. And again, it's that atmospheric carbon pool that gets the most attention because this pool can affect global temperatures and affect climate change. Now, when we talk about the quantities of carbon, we use a lot of terms that are typically not part of our everyday conversational speech. We use terms like teragrams, petagrams, gigatons, billion metric tons. And all these terms capture the fact that these are very, very large quantities. Now, since the start of the Industrial Revolution, we began pulling out geologic carbon in the form of coal, oil, and gas to the tune of about 8.7 petagrams of carbon per year to fuel our growing industries. And this pool, which is part of the geologic pool, had previously locked up this carbon, meaning keeping it apart from the above ground carbon cycle for a very long time. Now, during the Industrial Revolution, we began introducing this carbon into the above ground carbon cycle through fossil fuel extraction and consumption. And similarly, as we cleared land for industrial expansion through agriculture, for agriculture and places to live, we began emitting an additional 1.4 petagrams of carbon to the atmosphere. Now, with this additional carbon in the atmosphere, the oceans were able to sequester a little bit more, an additional 2.3 petagrams of carbon from the atmosphere. And the land masses were able to sequester a little bit more. That was about an additional 3 petagrams. But as I mentioned earlier, this is a zero-sum game. And even though the oceans and land masses were sequestering more carbon, meaning pulling it from the atmosphere, it was not enough to offset all the additional emissions into the atmosphere from fossil fuel consumption. So since the Industrial Revolution, we've been increasing above ground carbon, and specifically that atmospheric carbon pool, by about 4.1 petagrams annually. So the aim we have here is to sequester this atmospheric carbon, pull it from the atmosphere, and store it into one of the other pools. And we know forests play an important role in this, but I'll say right from the outset that forests are not the solution to mitigating climate change, but they are certainly a part of the solution. And we recognize that forests play an important role in carbon cycles through storage and sequestration of carbon from the atmosphere. So what I want to do now is turn our attention to the role that forests have in sequestering, that is removing carbon from the atmosphere, and then storing that carbon. So here in Pennsylvania, we have about 16.6 million acres of forest across the Commonwealth. Pennsylvania is about 58% forested, and over the past several decades, the amount of forest has remained relatively stable. And as was mentioned earlier by Matt and Seth, of course, much earlier in our state's history, we did have more forest area. So prior to settlement of Pennsylvania, it's estimated there were around 26 million acres of forest here in Pennsylvania, meaning that the Commonwealth was once over 90% forested. And then, of course, there was that period of forest exploitation, which we talked about a little bit earlier during the turn of the last century. And here we saw the area of forest area dip down into its lowest acreage in recent history. But since that time, we have rebounded to that 16.6 million acres of second growth forest that we have maintained over recent decades. Now, make no mistake, we are losing forest in Pennsylvania to development and conversion of forest to non-forest land uses. But we've maintained a relatively stable forested land base in terms of acreage because of reversions. And that is non-forest land that's reverting back to a forested condition based on our definitions of what a forest is. So although the acreage of forested land in Pennsylvania has been relatively stable over the past several decades, we are very concerned about forest acreage loss because of the health, quality, and vigor of the forests that are being converted compared to the health, quality, and vigor of the forests that are coming back. They are quite different. And this concern does apply to carbon because approximately half of the dry weight of wood in a tree is carbon. So healthy, high quality, vigorous forests sequester and store more carbon than unhealthy, low quality, and low vigor forests. And as we can see from the U.S. Forest Service data, the forests of Pennsylvania store a lot of carbon. And over the past decade or so, we have seen these increases, but these increases are occurring at a slower rate. And this has much to do with the current age class distribution of the forests in Pennsylvania that Matt talked about in the introduction. We currently have a very skewed age class distribution in our forests, meaning we have a lot of maturing and mature forests, but very little very old forests and little young forest. Now, there is no question that maturing and mature forests store a lot of carbon. You've got big trees, you've got large woody debris, and lots of organic forest litter. But as they age, the amount of carbon they sequester declines compared to when they were younger and rapidly growing. So the amount of carbon they are sequestering, meaning that actively pulling from the atmosphere through that process of photosynthesis, which is the process of using sunlight to synthesize food from water and carbon dioxide, which releases oxygen, and creates food that gets converted to wood or that stored carbon. And this process is decreasing. And it's that sequestration of carbon from the atmosphere that is what we need to increase in order to slow climate change. But nonetheless, these data are showing that the forests of Pennsylvania are adding stored carbon currently, and we have since seen increases in carbon over the last decade. So in a forest, the largest proportion of carbon is stored in the above ground biomass. So this is the live trees, the shrubs, the ground floor, all the vegetation in a forest that's above ground. And then this is followed by what's in the forest soil organics. And this highlights the importance of maintaining healthy, vigorous forests in terms of carbon. And in a tree in particular, the majority of the carbon is stored in the bole, or what we commonly refer to as the trunk. So at this time, I'm just going to pause for a real brief second or so just to ask if there's anything in the chat, if there's any questions about carbon cycles and forest carbon before we shift gears and talk a little bit about carbon markets. So Matt, is there anything we want to address at this point?
Yes, Sean, we do have one question, and it's a question related to your discussion about the petagrams of carbon that you addressed earlier in the presentation. What percentage of the 4.1 petagrams do forests sequester?
Oh my, off the top of my head, I don't know that answer. But that's something we could look into. And again, this is kind of off of different research, different estimates that were made, and knowing, that oceans are pulling in, forests are pulling in, and other, prairie, things like that. Other things do sequester carbon. But what percentage of that is being sequestered, I don't know off the top of my head. Sorry about that.
No worries. Thank you. That's the only question we have loaded in the chat so far, so I think we're ready to continue.
Okay, great. So now what I want to do is I just want to talk a little bit about carbon markets, specifically what they are and how they came about. And to do that, I think the first thing we need to do is just differentiate between the two types of carbon market constructs. We have what's known as the compliance market, or what we call the cap and trade systems, and the voluntary markets. So when we think about the compliance markets, the construct that comes to most people's minds is the California Carbon Registry. And this was created by the California Air Resources Board around the year 2006. And the concept behind this was pretty straightforward. The idea was to reduce carbon emissions in California to 1990 levels by a specified date and time, specified date in the future. So what they did is they identified the largest emitters in California, and then they set a maximum emissions level for each of those companies. They then set up a schedule of reduced emissions targets that must be met by a specified benchmark dates in order to meet the goal of getting back to those 1990 emissions level. So the identified companies that had to be in compliance with this had a few choices in order for them to be in compliance. So the first thing they could do is reduce the emissions to get below the targets that were set at those benchmark dates. The second thing they could do is, if they weren't meeting those targets, is they could buy allowances from the California Air Resources Board to account for the emissions that they were still putting out there above the targets that were set for them at the specified benchmark dates. Which it's important to keep in mind that the number of available allowances that were provided by the California Air Resources Board is limited, and it actually decreases over time. And they're also really expensive. So those are two options: meet the targets, buy allowances, or the third thing they could do is buy carbon credits to offset their excess emissions from a carbon credit generating project that reduces emissions or enhances carbon sequestration. And these types of credits are less expensive than buying the allowances. So that is a very brief description of what a compliance market is, and a little bit about how they came about and what they do. Now, the other type of markets are the voluntary markets. And the important thing to keep in mind about this is there is no regulatory requirement for any entity to participate in this type of market at all. but thousands of companies are, because they're voluntarily setting or making these net zero or carbon neutral claims for their company that they can back up by purchasing carbon offsets to zero out the emissions footprint of their business. So companies are seeking offsets, which has led to the registries for selling offsets. It's led to the project developers coming on the scene to help assist in designing and enrolling entities, such as forest landowners, into carbon offset generating programs, and then also space for brokers to do the exchanges of the offsets. And there's a lot that goes into, there's a lot that goes into generating and selling an offset. There are contracts, there's terms, there's accepted projects, there's quantification of carbon, verification, and the shepherding of the transactions. So that's a real brief explanation of the voluntary markets. There's a lot more we could discuss about that, but that's kind of how they came about and the gist of those. But what I want to do also say at this point is that I use the terms credits and offsets several times, and they're often used interchangeably, but a carbon credit typically applies to the compliance markets and carbon offsets apply to voluntary markets. So there's a distinction between the two. But at any rate, what are these things? Well, the bottom line with these is they are commodities. So just like wheat, copper, or coffee, or anything like that, they're a commodity. And by definition, a commodity is something that has value and can be bought and sold. It's measurable, quantifiable, verifiable, and traceable. And a carbon credit or offset is equal to 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide, which really just means that any greenhouse gas is then standardized to CO2 in terms of what's in the credit or the offset. So what are the characteristics of a carbon credit or an offset? So what makes these good? Well, a good carbon credit or offset needs to meet these requirements. First requirement is it must be additional. And what this means is that the carbon in the credit or offset would not have happened without the project that generated the credit. So it has to be above and beyond business as usual. So for example, as a forest landowner, if you have a management plan in place for your forest, you cannot generate credits simply by following your existing plan, because that's the business as usual. That's your plan. Rather, you must deviate from your existing plan by amending your plan with an approved carbon enhancing project that you implement on your land to generate additional carbon sequestration and storage. So it's got to be additional, not just business as usual. It must be quantifiable, meaning the inventory and quantification of the existing and additional carbon storage must follow accepted standards of quantification. The additional carbon must be permanent, or at least be there for the period of time that's specified in the contract for those credits or those offsets. It must demonstrate non-leakage, and this one's a little bit tough, but what this really means is that your carbon enhancing project does not lead to increased emissions in another area as a result of your carbon enhancing project that you implemented. And then finally, it must be verifiable. So the carbon credits or offsets must be verified by a third party. So I know I covered quite a bit pretty quickly, but in conclusion, I just want to make a few statements here about, carbon cycles are complex systems. Pennsylvania's 16.6 million acres of forest are storing a lot of carbon and do play an important role in removing carbon from the atmosphere. Just keep in mind, forests are not the solution to climate change, but they're certainly a part of the solution. And there are two types of carbon markets that are out there. We have the compliance and the voluntary markets, and the credits or offsets that are traded in these markets must meet rigorous standards to be valid. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Matt if we have any questions.
Thank you there we go. Thank you very much, Sean. We do have two questions, and I'm going to take them in the logical order based on what you just presented. First question, can you provide a practical example of an actual project that will generate credits and/or offsets?
An actual project? Afforestation efforts So we have abandoned mine lands, something like that. If you would go into reforesting an abandoned mine land, that would be one where that would be a project where you could clearly identify additionality, where if you had not entered that project by planting those trees, that additional carbon would not have happened had you not done that. So that's probably one of the clearest examples of a project.
And Sean, specifically with an offset, I think would you agree that the key for additionality there is that the funding that is provided by the purchaser of the offset is what enables the change in behavior to be made, such as planting those trees, that afforestation project. That's how it's connected, correct?
Absolutely. Yeah, there's got to be something to fund that effort. There's got to be some incentive to do that work, and through a carbon market program like that, where you would be receiving funds for doing that through the sale of the carbon credits or the offsets, I think that would be an incentive to do that or help facilitate that activity.
Very good. And I do believe our next panelist will be able to provide some more information related to that question as well. One more question to present to you, Sean, and this was brought up a little bit toward the middle of your presentation, and the question is, what does all of this analysis mean in terms of public use of our forests in the future? Outdoor recreation is now our #2 largest industry. Is this analysis going to stifle or encourage more public access to our forests in Pennsylvania? And so that was related to the part of your presentation related to how we analyze the impact of forests on the carbon equation.
Is that question in the chat, if I can see it again? So we're asking how recreation would impact our forests of Pennsylvania in terms of carbon sequestration?
I think the question is intended to say we're talking about forest carbon, we're having this conversation, and we're talking about how DCNR may manage our public forests with this in mind. Is this going to change how the public has access to our forests?
Oh, I wouldn't think so. No. This is one of the other uses, many uses, resources, uses, and values, ecosystem services that forests provide. Pennsylvania forests provide. There's many of those, and carbon is just another one of those. So I don't see us limiting any access in any way because there's a carbon project occurring in any one area. It's just like our other forest management activities, aside from when the actual activity is occurring for safety reasons, of course. But after that, the public is still welcome on those lands.
I think that's a really big point as far as what we're talking about in this conversation related to DCNR and the CNRAC is that DCNR has a mission, and that mission has many aspects to it. And one of those missions is to manage the shared use lands in our forest system and across the Commonwealth. So would you agree that the mission of DCNR remains unchanged? It's rather just another calculation that's added to the mix as far as how proper management of these public resources is conducted?
Absolutely. I think it's the same. I mean, it's still, with carbon management, forest management, I mean, we're looking at sustainable management. And again, we're looking at balancing the many resources, uses, values, ecosystem services that our forests provide. And again, carbon's just another one of those that we're adding into the equation.
Very good. All right. We do have time for a couple more questions, and they are coming into the chat. So I'm going to try to make sure to get these out there to you. So here's the next question I have for you. You mentioned that non-leakage is a difficult factor to assess. Would you share about confidence or complications that exist in forest carbon markets in Pennsylvania related to leakages? As an example, reduced availability of local durable wood products could lead to wood products sourced from further away or replaced with plastic products.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the concerns with leakage that I have is I think it's rather naive of us to think that if we reduce the amount of forest products that we put to the market, whether it's on state land or private land or state or country, it's naive of us to think that society as a whole is going to demand less. And we're still going to demand that resource, and it's likely going to come from lands or places that maybe not as sustainably managed as what it is here, at least on state forest land or in this country. So yeah, I have major concerns with that because we're talking globally. when we talk about carbon and we talk about these projects. And to think that just because we produce less means we're going to demand less, I think is rather naive.
Very good, very good. And I do think that it is relevant to the conversation that the discussion is related to the substitution effect. And we talked about that a little bit in the introduction about how utilizing one material that is more carbon positive or more carbon negative than another could change that equation. So very, very good way to think about that. Another question, presumably when wood is burned, the carbon is released into the atmosphere, correct?
Sure, yes.
So with that, I think that it's interesting to talk about what the substitution effect might be of what else may have been burned. So, for example, burning wood versus burning a fossil fuel. Could you address that a little bit?
Yeah, so again, when we think of the fossil fuels, as far as their ability to sequester carbon and store that carbon underground, I mean, that's on a geologic time scale. When we think of like forests, so we burn that wood, let's say, either for biofuel or we do prescribe burning activities, to encourage regeneration or the health of a forest. That idea that we might be emitting some carbon, but the gains that we're going to have by successfully regenerating that stand, creating that new forest, which is vigorously growing, which may not be packing on a lot of carbon yet, but it's certainly sequestering a lot of carbon. So it's starting to grow, it's sequestering that carbon from the atmosphere. And again, that's really the game that we need to be addressing is getting it from the atmosphere. So having it stored on the landscape is great, but we still need to be sequestering it from the atmosphere. So, that healthy, vigorous, young forest is really important. And through the burning of, through prescribed burns, or even, as we mentioned a little bit about biofuels, at least that one's a renewable resource compared to that geologic resource, which is going to take a long, long time for that carbon to go back into that pool.
Very good. We have a few more questions coming in. It is time to move on to our next presenter. I wanted to maybe wrap up a few of the concepts that are being presented in the question that I see in the chat to ask this. Why would DCNR care about the existence of carbon credits? Is this something that we are looking at because the state is looking to achieve those credits, or are we looking at it because it is something that is relevant in the forest landscape?
So as far as why we're looking at it or why we're interested in it, I think, we're really just trying to better understand what these markets are, what the pros and cons of them may be. There have been other states which actually put state forest land into carbon or selling credits from their state forest land. We are not in the Bureau of Forestry as of now. Right now, we're still just gathering in the information to determine, is this something that we should be doing? Is it something we should be encouraging, or is it something we should not be encouraging? So right now, we're not selling any kind of carbon credits from state forest land.
And that's a great summary as we get ready to move to our next panelist, because our next panelist is coming to us from the American Forest Foundation's Family Forest Carbon Program, and their focus has been on enabling family forest landowners, smaller landowners, to be able to access these markets and to be able to understand this. And so this conversation today is designed around enabling the general public to have that understanding in a more robust way. So with that, I will introduce Sarah Hall, and I am excited to hear what you have to say, Sarah. So I will hand it off to you.
Having some technical difficulties as usual. Are you seeing my screen?
Yes, it's coming through. It looks good. Go ahead.
All right. Uh-oh. 1 second here. I'm not seeing it on my end. Do you want to take some of the other questions while I troubleshoot this? My screen seemed to have failed me here.
As soon as I
about
answered you,
that.
this shared screen went away.
Go ahead. Why
Let's
don't
see if
you?
Sean. We can see if Sean might be willing to come back and take another question.
Sure, bring them on.
We appreciate your flexibility, Sean. Here's
That's
a
all right.
question for you. Are credits a legal requirement, and is there a public database that's viewable?
So for Pennsylvania, right now, to my understanding, there is no mandate. There was discussion of joining Reggie. We did, I guess, announce we were joining Reggie. I think that's all tied up in legislation, or not legislation, but in court cases. So right now for Pennsylvania, we don't have a cap and trade system or any legal requirement to do anything, but there is interest, or was interest, for us to join Reggie.
And does DCNR support the development of renewable energy sources on state lands that would require forests to be clear cut in order to install, such as solar panels and wind farms?
We are actually getting requests for that, and we do have people looking, at how do we handle that on state forest land? What is our obligation to accommodate that? Is that something we should accommodate? So that's not an area that I focus on, but we do have folks that are addressing, requests for solar panel installations, things like that.
And Sean, I can help you with that because there was a presentation at a CNRAC meeting recently where the DCNR policy office did share a white paper on the thoughtful siting of solar, and I think that there are discussions related to wind that are quite similar that that DCNR has interpreted up to this point that that DCNR does not have the regulatory authority to replace a forest with something like a grid scale solar installation. So there has been. And Seth, I see you're jumping in. You're more qualified than I am, so I'm happy to defer.
No, actually, you were doing great. That is exactly what I wanted to add. So I think it gets to earlier. We talked about, we have a technical assistance leadership role in helping conserve all the Commonwealth forests, and representing the resource. And so in light of that, like Matt said, there is some guidance that DCNR put out about how that DCNR participated in, about how to best site activities like grid scale solar. But and Matt's absolutely right. We do not have, per our enabling legislation, we do not have the authority to accommodate solar or wind on state forest land. But we think it's important to be part of the conversation because the requests are out there for other landowners, and people are looking at us to to kind of help work through what the impacts are to the Commonwealth forests, and how to best site them to minimize their impact. But we know, it's important to have an alternative energy portfolio. But working through where do we put these installations in the best place for the benefit of our natural resources as a whole. But right now we do not have that legislative authority on state forest land. Thank you.
Outstanding. Great save from both of you on coming in and helping make sure we can get through a few more questions. And I believe Sarah is ready. At least the slides would indicate as much.
This is, I'm having some severe technical difficulties here for some unknown reason. It's showing an old presentation. Sorry about this, folks.
I see. There is an old date on there.
I don't know what's happening.
You need another moment? I believe we can take one more question if you need another minute.
What are you seeing now? Are you seeing this below and above?
Yes, there it is. We're seeing your PowerPoint window. You just wanted to go to full screen. I think we'd be there. We go. Sarah, without further ado, I'm happy to
All
hand
right.
it off.
Sorry about that. Not sure what happened there. But thank you for the patience through the technical difficulties, and thank you for having me this afternoon today and to talk about the Family Forest Carbon Program. So just going to kind of touch on our program and maybe some of the topics that Seth and Sean also discussed earlier in their presentations. All right, so to start off, the Family Forest Carbon Program is a program of the American Forest Foundation, and I just wanted to start off by reading our mission. The American Forest Foundation is a nonprofit, mission-driven organization focused on partnering with private landowners to unlock the power of America's forests to fight climate change. And I think really the most important part of this statement is that we are a nonprofit. So that does not mean that the organization does not make profits. Of course, as you heard earlier, we do sell these offsets and carbon credits on the voluntary carbon market. But what it means is that those profits, we do not have shareholders. So we have a board and we have staff that administer this program. And so any profits, do not go to our board and do not go to shareholders. So any profits that we do make go right back into our forests, so into Pennsylvania forests, as well as into the landowners who we are providing the incentive payments to implement these climate smart practices on the ground. And so this program was developed between the Nature Conservancy, who I'm sure most of you are familiar with. They're a national and international conservation organization, with the American Forest Foundation. Back in 2017 is when we started doing the research to implement this program on the ground, which we did in 2020. And this program started in Pennsylvania, simply for the reasons that Seth and Sean did highlight. 70% of Pennsylvania's forest land is privately owned. And so it's really important that we provide an option for those private landowners to be a part of a climate solution, as well as improving the health of their forests at the same time. And so many of you have probably seen that diamond sign there, probably along some interstate highways in Pennsylvania, that says Wood, Water, Recreation, and Wildlife. And that is a program that's also administered by the American Forest Foundation. So that is the American Tree Farm System, and I'm sure many of you have seen those signs. And so again, I want to touch base on, why we're here and why we're doing this important work and, trying to unlock the power of forests. So trees are one of the world's oldest carbon capture technologies, as Sean touched on. And today they store nearly 13% of our country's annual greenhouse gas emissions. So private landowners, like those in Pennsylvania, own about 39% of America's forests. And as I said, 70% in Pennsylvania is privately owned, which is the largest portion of our country's woodlands. And so collectively, private landowners own about 290 million acres, which makes, the family forests owners a critical piece of the puzzle in fighting climate change and in combating climate change. And so if we mobilize this successfully, we believe that the U.S. forestry sector could double its capacity to capture and store carbon by 2030. And, voluntary carbon markets are emerging as a new financial vehicle for forest climate actions. And so these markets are a new financial tool for landowners to help them manage their land. And as Seth said, keep forests in forests, which is really the most important thing. And so through these markets, corporations can achieve their net zero goals by purchasing carbon credits from the entities that reduce or remove carbon emissions from the atmosphere. And, we understand on the surface, it seems like an obvious solution. If family forests could somehow be leveraged into those voluntary carbon markets, it would represent a triple win for landowners who earn value for the forest lands, for corporations who seek to neutralize their carbon emissions, and for the planet, which would benefit from this additional carbon capture, which stems from the tide of climate change, as well as other environmental benefits, such as biodiversity, water quality, clean air, as we discussed earlier. But it's not that easy. There are some barriers to overcome. And as Seth and Sean said, carbon is a new thing. There are new programs, and there's a lot to learn and adapt in these to really create a difference within our climate. And so first, most private landowners are blocked from carbon markets, and that's because of the really high costs that are associated with the measurement, reporting, and verification of these carbon programs, and in order to quantify an actual carbon credit. And so, that's why historically, really, only really large landowners over 3,000 acres or so could access these carbon markets, especially more on the regulatory side, but it was really, really difficult, nearly impossible for a small landowner to access these voluntary markets because of the high costs of the monitoring, verification, and reporting. And so that's where we, stepped in to try to, open these markets up to small family forest landowners. And that's where the Family Forest Carbon Program came in. And so what we're doing now is we're scaling the program. As I mentioned, we started in Pennsylvania, but we have scaled and opened up our program to areas like West Virginia and Western Maryland. But now, as of yesterday, we're open in all of the Northeast, so New York to Maine. We're in the Lake States, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, and hopefully planning to be in the Southern Appalachians early next year. And so we do have to, as Sean and Seth mentioned, the legitimacy of these programs. It's important that we make sure that the carbon that we are actually quantifying and selling as a credit is truly additional. And so what we've done is we've uniquely designed our program to enable access to these carbon markets for small family forest owners. And so we work diligently to address the risk and concerns in a way that brings companies and landowners together to get at the impact we all strive to achieve. And so AFF leans into our long and respected history of partnerships in order to do that. So as an organization, as I mentioned earlier, we trace our roots to the formation of the American tree farm system all the way back to 1941. And since then, we've developed a proven track record of engaging partnerships and developing innovative solutions that address pressing conservation challenges, whether that be mitigating wildfire, white oak initiatives, and things like that. Second, the FFCP is rooted in integrity, and that includes the companies that we work with. We only sell our carbon credits to companies who have already done everything in their power to reduce their carbon emissions before they're purchasing carbon credits as the last step that is needed to achieve their net zero strategies. And so these are companies like REI and Netflix, who are the main purchasers of our carbon credits, which provide Pennsylvania landowners with technical and financial assistance to implement these forest management practices that are scientifically proven to enhance carbon sequestration and storage in Pennsylvania's forests. And finally, AFF and the FFCP aims to produce the highest quality forest carbon credit on the market. And we've pioneered a carbon accounting methodology that directly addresses these concerns of quality and credibility so that, that many carbon credit projects do struggle with. And so I will talk about, our methodology here in a moment. All right, so our methodology, it really is the first of its kind innovative carbon accounting methodology. And this is how we can be confident that we are actually sequestering additional carbon. So our first of its kind methodology was approved by a third party called VERA's Verified Standard Carbon Standard back in fall of 2022. And it compares the carbon sequestered on lands, you see here, enrolled in our carbon program to a control group that are of highly similar forests that are not enrolled in the program. And so by measuring the difference between the forests over time, our methodology isolates that our program is the key intervention that created that additional carbon benefit. So this approach to using real similar forests in real time is called a dynamic baseline, which is constantly updated to account for changes in systems and landscapes, new policies that may come about, and other factors that may change the outcome of the program's intervention. This is unlike traditional methodologies which typically set one project baseline, which are typically modeled with a computer at the beginning of a project and are based on assumptions rather than the ever-changing reality that we live in. And so here you can see this graph on the bottom, I think shows a really good example of that, where, as Seth mentioned, one tool in the toolbox to combating climate change and using this as a natural solution is extended rotations. And that's really what our practice in the growing mature forest practice in Pennsylvania is all about. We are not saying do not harvest timber. What we are saying is let's lengthen the time between harvests so that we can maximize that carbon sequestration and storage. And so you can see that on that figure there in the bottom right. We're extending that rotation. We're encouraging more sustainable practices when those trees do get harvested, and that additional carbon between the two, so between our program and our enrollees and business as usual harvesting, is what the additional carbon is that we sell in an offset agreement. So they did mention permanence, and that's one thing that we are very concerned about as well. And so to address permanence, what we've done is develop a robust and engaged landowner community. So all of our landowners that are enrolled have a community. We have an app where people can, engage together. We do in-person and virtual events. We also do remotely monitor all of our enrolled properties for compliance and post-contract change detection. So while only a small subset of our landowners and our enrolled properties are selected for monitoring, we do remotely monitor all of them. And then we do compensate for any reversals or carbon losses that we do see in that monitoring. And so we are scaling. So to kind of point, address some of the leakage issues as well. And leakage is one thing we're also worried about. We do, because of VERA's standard, reduce what our actual climate benefit is to account for that leakage. And then also we're scaling our program. So, in terms of wood coming from elsewhere, we're trying to scale this across the entire country so that we're encouraging these more sustainable practices when that wood does get harvested. So as I said, we are working hard to scale in all of these regions and hopefully beyond that as the years come. And so our goals are big. We are trying to sequester and store an additional 50 million tons by 2030, which equates to about 11 million cars off of the road. And we have even bigger long-term goals, 1 billion tons by 2050. And we really need a partnership between all of the organizations and agencies here today, as well as landowners, and industries in order to reach these goals. So partners are really important in climate work to work together to really achieve all of these climate goals and make a real impact. And so the important part really, though, when we're working with landowners, is to focus on what their priorities are as a landowner. And so we recognize that one of the barriers to landowners managing their land is income, it's money. And so our typical term agreements is 20 years, which is that extended rotation amount. And depending on the practice, landowners can earn about $150 to $300 an acre over the 20 years, and they receive about 20% upfront and 3 to 5% during years 2 to 19, with an additional 10% paid in year 20. And so we are, giving these financial incentives right to landowners so they can better manage their land and implement these practices that are proven to enhance our carbon stocks. So what this means is that we are paying landowners to conduct the practice, and it's not contingent upon the frequent and expensive carbon storage measurement and verification on the property. And so we guarantee our payments no matter what the carbon markets do. And I think the other really good thing and really great benefit for landowners is that we do provide a forest management plan for any landowners who do not have it. So trained foresters will help landowners create a comprehensive plan that's tailored to their objectives. And we provide long-term support. So, like I said, landowners are part of a like-minded community, and we'll provide forester support and technical assistance support throughout the life of the 20-year contract. So one final note, the elephant in the room here is timber harvesting. So what about timber harvesting? Many carbon programs present carbon and timber as values in opposition to one another. Either you can harvest trees or you can accumulate carbon. But this does not have to be true. And in fact, carbon programs can help us manage our woods in a way that maximizes the value of the wood and the property long term. So nearly all of our practices, no matter what location you're in, allow some degree of harvesting. We just want to ensure that that management is sustainable, and we limit how much can be harvested. This, benefits the landowner enrolled in the program, but it also benefits the industry, which provides high quality, higher priced timber in the long run, helping everyone to create a healthier, more resilient forest after 20 years. Like I said, growing mature forests is our main practice in Pennsylvania. It's really all about extending rotations over those 20 years. We limit the amount of harvesting and thinning allowed, but harvesting is allowed. And we have sustainable guidelines for that. So our partnership can achieve healthy forests, financial legacy, especially for the landowner. It's really important that we keep our forests as forests, and folks need money to do that. And then fighting climate change, as we said. So it's really simple. Landowners can go to familyforestcarbon.org, speak to representatives, work with a forester, whether that's our staff or consultants we work with, and then review contract, which we have people, to help along the way. And it's a very simple process for landowners. Happy to walk anybody through that if they need assistance. And then if you are or know any consulting foresters, we do work with consultants to work with landowners in our program. So we're happy to, get more consulting foresters on board and trained, and working directly with Pennsylvania landowners, which helps you to grow your business as well. And with that, thank you, and thanks for the patience through the technical difficulties.
Sir, that's great. I'm glad we were able to get through that. And I have to say that one thought comes to mind before we get to a couple of questions is as the purpose of this webinar, it really is to facilitate the conversations that the CNRAC can bring to DCNR and to the general public. And it occurs to me to point out just what an interesting mix of specialties that are and talents are brought to the CNRAC, with yourself and the CNRAC being a volunteer position, but then this being something that you have a national profile in. Really interesting. Same way that we look at the part 1 webinar, and we have a geologist that is on our CNRAC, and then the conversation we had with the geologic survey and the discussions that we had around that. So really neat how this ties all together. Wanted to put together a few questions that came up in the chat while you were presenting. One, where does your funding come from? And then I just want to tie that together with another question, which is, what exactly does the money generated through purchase of carbon credits do? Where does it go, and what does it ultimately finance? For example, is it planting of more trees, salaries of forest managers, cash of forest family forest owners? So where does your money come from, and what is it used for?
Yeah, sure. All great questions. So we have sort of a mixed bag of funding. So we have philanthropic donations. As I said, our payments are guaranteed to landowners. It's a big cost to get this thing up front and running. And of course, we don't see a huge return until we start generating credits, right? So we have philanthropic donations, but the voluntary carbon markets are generally what support our program. So that's where the financials are coming from, as well as grants. So we have secured a number of grants to help us with this work, that is, supported by many partners, some of whom are in this room as well. The biggest one being the most recent Climate Smart Commodities grant, which was one of the biggest grants we've ever gotten. And in terms of where that money goes, to answer the second part of the question, the majority of it goes right to the landowners to implement these practices. So as I said, those payments are guaranteed. We do give payments every year throughout the life of the 20-year contract. Of course, that does also help to fund our staff that are implementing this program on the ground. And I will just add too that we are also piloting and testing new practices. So the Growing Mature Forest practice is just one we have right now as a new program in Pennsylvania, but we do have other practices in other regions. Our practices are forest species and forest type dependent, so we don't do the same practices in different types of forests. And the major one is afforestation and reforestation. We're currently piloting that program in the South, and we hope to test it and scale it for things like hopefully mineland reclamation if we see, that it works, or even pasture lands and things up in this area as well as out in the Midwest where there are more farmlands. So all of the above it goes to, basically.
Very good. One specific question that came in related to your program. When you come upon a legacy oil or gas well in a private forest, do you link an owner up with a program to cap the well?
We do not, but that's one thing that's actually a great point that we could definitely note. When we do encounter any sort of wells or development or even just fields, we exclude those areas from the project area. So that is one difference between our program and some other carbon programs. You do not have to enroll all of your acreage. So we would exclude those types of areas from our projects. And yeah, we should try to connect folks with someone else to help them. That's a great comment.
And I think that's one of the interesting discussions that we've gotten into, is just that this is a program, unlike many others, that involves human beings going out and walking the acres and having that connection with the land. So it would enable those sort of conversations. Last question I have for Sarah, and then we'll see if we have an opportunity to bring the rest of our panelists back. Does the Family Forest Carbon Program work with any partners to promote forest products that offer carbon co-benefits or that come from forests managed for carbon specifically?
Yes, and that work is going to be even more thorough and ongoing here into the future with the Climate Smart Commodities Grant. So that is a big piece of our Climate Smart Commodity Grants. We, of course, partner and try to work with groups like that Matt leads, the Pennsylvania Forest Products Association. We do quantify some of the carbon that is stored in the products that will eventually get harvested. It is a small portion of our equation, but yes, we do work. AFF has been an organization, a national organization that has worked with the forest products industry and other sustainable forestry organizations for many decades now, and that is a partnership that we look to continue, as well as build upon as our program grows.
Outstanding. We are looking like we are coming right in on the nose as far as the timing of this webinar. I wanted to ask if Seth or Sean wanted to come back to share any final thoughts, since they've been off the stage here.
I'll leave it to you, Seth.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I just have an appreciation for the number of people who dialed in. And I definitely appreciate our partners who are present here. I looked through the invite and I saw a lot of partners. In addition to Sarah's organization and CNRAC, it's really important to continue the conversation just because there's a lot to know and understand, and we are trying to balance a lot of different values. And they're all the values are very important to people. So it's really about how we fit the carbon conservation, carbon management into that bigger picture of forest conservation and all the values that we're trying to manage for. So definitely welcome the questions and the conversation. It's one we're going to be having for some time as we look to get a handle on this, try different things, learn from each other. So thank you for bringing us all together.
Outstanding. And we are at 1:30 on the nose. I want to point out on our final slide, there is a website for the Conservation and Natural Resources Advisory Committee. If you were to Google DCNR CNRAC, CNRAC, or if you look at the website that is listed on the slide displayed on the screen, there is an opportunity for a contact form there. So if anybody has any questions that they were not able to get to here, I encourage you to direct your correspondence in that direction. And we certainly welcome the feedback and the opportunity to engage in this CNRAC conversation. I want to thank everybody for spending the last 90 minutes with us, and we look forward to the next opportunity to engage in these conversations. Thank you to our panelists, and thank you to everybody who joined us today.